Okay, welcome to Lecture 4, my third lecture, but Lecture 4 for Module 3 of 939. And we're going to wrap up talking about the elements of strategic leadership in this lecture, and looking at organizational climate. Hopefully you enjoyed the TED Talk there by Dan. I'll just call him Dan because, again, not sure how to say his last name. And, as I mentioned in my last lecture, don't agree with him 100% on everything, but I like the perspective on, again, thinking about culture and not just how do we reward people, but what do we put value on, and I think that illustrates, his research that he did there with building the Bionicles, and then, but then also the page, and do we actually check it and things like that. That's a cultural norm. Do we inspect what we expect, and do we reward people appropriately, or is it just a hey, you got stuff done, I didn't really check it, pat him on the head, the good dog, if I can put it that way, kind of feedback. And so just thinking through those things from a culture standpoint. So let's talk about organizational climate. And I know I tend to say this, but I don't think this lecture is going to be as long as the others as we wrap up in this area. What is the climate? So, what is climate in an organization? And in simple terms, and by the way, a lot of time, in the next slide I'm going to talk about is climate versus culture, because I will warn you, some people use the terms interchangeably, organizational climate and organizational culture. They're different. I'm not the only one who feels that way, but I do feel strongly that there is a difference between the organizational culture and the organizational climate. And so what is the climate? Well, in simple terms, think about the climate as far as weather climate. Climate is what it feels like over long periods of time at an organization. Just like when we talk about the climate weather-wise of a location, of a geographic area, we are talking about what it feels like over long periods of time. And so I put this, it is not a snapshot in time of the environment. Now, I probably need to be a little bit clarifying here. In that, because some of the things that you read about climate, they'll say, well, it's what it's like on a day-to-day basis at the organization. That's true. Yet at the same time, the reason I say it's not necessarily just a snapshot in time is this. If some days are horrible at an organization, nobody can control that. That doesn't mean that's what the climate is all the time. I mean, there have been some places where I've flown in or traveled in, and it's just pouring down rain. Well, and I'm there for a few hours, maybe a day. That doesn't mean that's what it's like, and so I can say, oh, I hate, Jonesville, making that up. I hate Jonesville. It's raining. Well, I'm there one day. My mom, love her to death, but my wife and I kind of chuckled at her because she made this comment when we lived in Greenville, and we still go back there fairly often. We drive, when you have 4 kids, you price yourself out of airline tickets. And my mom and dad have driven that route plenty as well. And you go through Knoxville, Tennessee. And it seemed like often when my parents were driving through Knoxville, it was raining. And so my mom made the same one time. Well, it's always raining in Knoxville. And so, we've laughed a few times because actually most of the time we go through Knoxville, it's not raining. And so we always, we'll drive through and it'll be perfectly sunny. There it is. It's raining in Knoxville again, right? Because she's literally driving through Knoxville for, it might take about 45 minutes from one end to the other to get through all of the Knoxville area in a moment in time. And her conclusion is it's always raining. And so we have to, that's what I'm talking about. It's not just a snapshot in time of the environment, because I can walk into an organization and it, something could have happened. It could be a chaotic day, something like that. And it's like, ugh, it's a bad day. Or it could be a super wonderful day. That doesn't mean that's what it's always like at that organization. And so, but the climate is what it feels like over long periods of time on a day-to-day basis. That's what we're driving at with climate. Just like the climate of the weather climate. Again, another illustration. When we moved here back in 2003, the first time, then we left and then came back. When we moved to Nebraska, my wife at that point had never lived here. I grew up here. She'd been to visit, but had never lived here. And we moved here in the summer, and we were heading towards winter. And she said, Zora, the winter's pretty rough here. I said, it gets cold and stuff. I said, but snow-wise, and this is true, Nebraska doesn't get a ton of snow. And I think some people view us the same as like Minnesota or Wisconsin, the Great Lakes states that get a ton of snow. I said, no, on the whole, we really don't get a ton of snow. And I said a lot of times too, it'll snow and then warm up and melt and snow again. Well, that winter, that was starting January of 2004. It was a little bit like just this past year's winter. It snowed, I think, 4 or 5 weeks. Every Monday consecutively, we got at least 6 inches of snow, I think. And it stayed cold, and so it never melted. It was it was the whole Midwest, but we had so much snow here. I remember they had to start trucking the snow out of downtown because they had, plowing the streets and parking lots, and there was no place to go with the snow because it wasn't melting. And so they're piling it into dump trucks and hauling it out to the farmers' fields and dumping it out there. And that's just, and so I kept telling her, this isn't what it's like. This isn't normal, right? Because that's not the overall climate. Well, she could have judged Nebraska on that one winter. So they have tons of snow all the time. That's what we have to be careful about with climate. So I think you get the idea. So moving on. The next slide there, climate versus culture. And this is, I think, an important point. And culture is much more connected to the values, both stated and unstated. And it is how we get things done or what we get done. And I talked about that in the last lecture that I did. But culture it's much more connected to the values, the stated and unstated. It's how we get things done, what we get done. Climate is impacted by culture. And I would put it this way. Climate is more readily felt by all levels of organizational members. So, because it's what it feels like all the time to work there. Sometimes a frontline worker, and I'm not indicating that they're not intelligent, but they're not thinking in terms of culture. Because here's my job and I need to get my job done. But they are very much aware of what is the organizational climate. What does it feel like to work here today? Because, I'm getting a lot of pressure, or it's a really great environment, or what have you. Now, again, that's impacted by the overall culture, but they're not typically, a lot of members aren't thinking about the culture on a regular basis. That's what I mean by that. So let's talk about some of those climate considerations. The first one, and that tacks on to what I said just a minute ago. Climate is felt much more personally. I don't personally feel the culture as much. I'm aware of it at times, but I don't feel the culture. I feel the climate, right? And so, thinking about ethnic culture, a lot of times cultural practices and norms are impacted by environmental climate. That's true. They work on one another. Well, our culture doesn't work on climate per se, but the climate can impact things that we do culturally. One of the big things they do in Minnesota, I've always appreciated Minnesotans, if I'm saying that correctly, and Wisconsin. Nonians, I don't know, people in Wisconsin, because my brother put it this way one time: they've learned to embrace winter. Whereas Nebraska, we tend to just hunker down because it's cold. They've learned to embrace it. So, I mean, they have big winter celebrations. They do ice palaces, things like that. Those are cultural for them. Their states and cities, cultural traditions and norms and everything else impacted by the climate. If they, Hawaii doesn't have that, right? But Hawaii has other things within their culture that the climate impacts. And so that's that idea. So climate is felt much more personally. And it's another consideration of climate is this. The organization can be doing very well, but the climate may be suffering. What I mean is that the organization might be, very profitable, very successful, but the climate for individual members is not good. It might be restrictive or oppressive or just a negative, toxic kind of environment. And even that word toxic, a lot of times we'll talk about a toxic culture. I would argue actually what we're talking about a lot of times, if we use the term toxic, it's really toxic climate. It would probably be the better term to use, because that's what it feels like to work here. But, we may be going up in enrollment for our college, but because of decisions being made at the higher levels, or, I have a lousy division chair or director, and so it doesn't, even though the college is being successful, I don't like working here. And then the reverse of that, conversely, the organization could be struggling, and the climate may be great. And sorry to keep using a college illustration, it's the most ready one. So our enrollment may be declining. I'm dedicated to the organization. I'm dedicated to the institution. I love my coworkers. I love my students. I love the administration. We all, and I don't mean this in a goofy way, but we get along. We love each other. We're in this together. But for whatever reason, enrollment's declining. So, and I just bring that up because sometimes, or there can be a danger if I look only at the results or the success of the organization, or if I only look at climate. You've got to look at the whole picture to get the full picture, because I can look and say, look, meaning, so if I'm the top leader, of the organization, and I can look at our chart or our results sheet and say, whew, we're doing great. Look at that. And what I don't know is I've got this mutiny boiling, or I'm about ready to lose a bunch of really good people because the climate underneath is not good. Vice versa, as an individual employee, I can lose sight of the big picture because I can be like, man, I love coming to work every day. Life is great. And if I'm not paying attention, and this can happen too, upper leadership may not be giving all of the details, but life is great, then all of a sudden there's layoffs. What do you mean there's layoffs? I thought things were great here. Well, you're looking at it from a climate standpoint. You love working there. Life is good, but our results haven't been good. So hopefully you understand that. And understand this, climate is often why someone leaves an organization. And that can be impacted by culture as a whole too. But understand, the reason why a lot of people will choose to leave an organization is because of what it feels like on a day-to-day basis in their team, in their environment. And so that leads us to the next slide. So go ahead and look at that one. More climate considerations. Climate is often much more team-based. Now, there will be an overarching, overall organizational climate, but a lot of times climate is more intensely felt at the team level. And the Gallup organization it makes this statement. It's one of their authors in particular, I can't remember which one, but it was from Gallup Books. People leave managers, not organizations. And I don't agree with that statement 100%. For myself personally, there was one situation where the organization wasn't that great. And the job itself was not something that was really my passion area too. So it was kind of a combination. But my immediate manager, I really liked him. I got along with him well, thought he did a good job. He was a good manager to work for. It's just the work itself wasn't that appealing to me. Plus, in the broader organization, there were some concerns and things like that. So I'm not ready to say every single time 100% I agree with this. But often, I would say that is the case, that people leave managers, not organizations. Because depending on how high or how big the organization is, to a certain extent, the way the CEO or the C-suite officers, if you will, operate will have little to any bearing on me personally. Now, big, high-level decision, yeah, but I mean, I don't interact with, most of the time on a daily basis, the president. And again, it depends on the size of your organization. So that but I usually do interact fairly frequently on a daily basis with my immediate supervisor. Whether that be an academic department, it might be a department head or director or division chair, maybe a dean. Or, in another environment, a shift supervisor or middle manager or something like that. Their behavior does typically impact me much more readily on a daily basis. And so I may be tempted to exit the organization just because today in my, on a regular basis in my team, I like where the organization's going, but something needs to change here within this team. And then in defense of managers, a lot of times managers can feel strain in this area. I mentioned, I think in the last lecture that I did about the leadership workshop academy that we did at State Farm. And one of the assessments that we did is it told you how much buffering the manager had to do. And so the manager would get this feedback. And what that meant was it showed them the climate that the manager was creating in their team. And then it told the manager the climate they were experiencing. And sometimes what we would see is the manager had a really good climate that he or she was creating on their team. But they had and I'm showing gaps because that's what it indicated. A big gap was, if you had a big gap, it meant you had a not very good climate. If a little gap meant good climate. So they would have a little gap, good climate that they had created on their team, but then they would have a big gap that they were living in from their supervisor, meaning it wasn't a good climate. And that's what we talked about, buffering. And so we would look at that and we would have a concern because it tells us that that manager is doing a really good job of buffering for their team. They're insulating their team from the bad climate, but you can only do that so long. I mean, the stress builds, and we would see it in some of these managers. You could tell. I mean, they would walk in as like, the heavy load on their shoulders. And so managers can feel the strain in this area too. And so it's just something to be aware of. So last slide here. Let's talk about climate and strategy. And they do intersect, but it's probably felt the most where we see the impact of strategy and strategic thinking, strategic planning, and all of that is probably felt most when we actually get into implementation as far as the climate. So you want to be thinking about the climate as you're doing your strategic thinking, your strategic planning, but know that you really won't feel it per se until you start implementing the plan, because that's then when it's going to have an impact on the climate. And the reason for that is because generally implementing your strategy typically involves, some type of change, organizational change. And that's where it will impact your climate, because change can greatly impact the organizational climate. And so I'm just putting this out there as something that we should be aware of as leaders as we are instituting or instigating our strategy and implementing our strategy. It is going to bring about change, varying levels. And we're going to talk all about change at the end of the semester. But no matter what, it's going to change things a little bit, because even if your strategy, it may not seem that revolutionary, but if you move people's chairs and desks around, you'd be amazed at how much impact that has on the climate. So, I mean, you need to be aware of this. And so some things to be aware of are a couple of indicators that I like to give in times of change that impact climate. Are your typically engaged people seeming disengaged? Jane over there, she is just, normally she's, on fire and just, knocking it out, and she loves being here, and I can tell, but there's something off. There's something different lately. It seems like ever since we started this change process, or, have started implementing the strategy, that's an indicator. She's, normally very, very engaged, and now she seems less engaged, or even potentially disengaged, as opposed to Bob. Bob's never been engaged at all, right? So, I can't, he's still disengaged. But my normally engaged people are not like what they normally are. Another thing that kind of connects with that and this may seem trivial, are absences and illnesses on the rise. All of a sudden, we've started down this change road. We've implemented our strategy. More people than normal are calling in sick or are taking time off. That's an indicator, by the way. That's a key indicator that something's going on and you need to pay attention. So check your climate. That's a good, you see these things happening, don't let them get too far, and you go, whoa, wait a minute. And you do a quick check-in with everyone. How are things going? And you may need to do some corrections. It doesn't mean you change your strategy, because as we're going to talk about, you've thought this through, you've planned this out, this is the direction we need to head. I'm not suggesting, but no, now you're impacting climate, and that's what it feels like. And there's a danger of losing good people. So that's where then you need to step in, not change things, but talk with them, communicate, and I'm a big fan of that. So that's what I'm getting at with climate and strategy. So hopefully this has been helpful to you, going through these elements of strategic leadership as we lay the foundation, and we'll look to continue building on this in the next module.